Welcome to Sexology, a podcast that untangles the science of sex and pleasure. And now, with this week's episode, your host, clinical psychologist, Dr. Nazanin Moali.
Hello and welcome to episode 208 of Sexology Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Nazanin Moali. Hope you all are doing well and enjoying this holiday season as much as you can during this global pandemic time. Today we welcome Dr. Ali Mushtaq on our show. We're going to talk about BDSM. We're going to talk about Islam and how Ali navigated this realm as someone who grew up in a conservative Pakistani family and then came out as someone who identifies as gay, and now he's teaching BDSM. Before I tell you more about this episode, I wanted to invite you guys to take our quiz. A few months ago, I created this quiz on how to be a great lover because many of my clients, they always ask me, what does it mean to be a good lover? And I looked into a number of different research studies and drafted this quiz. It takes about 5 to 7 minutes to take the quiz, and you get an immediate response, and you learn what are some of the areas that you can focus on if you want to be a better lover, and what are some of the areas that you're doing excellent. So as I shared with you guys that our guest is Dr. Ali Mushtaq, we're going to talk about how he uses BDSM as a vehicle for social justice and empowerment. Ali has his PhD in Sociology from University of California, San Francisco, and Master's in Social and Demographic Analysis from University of California, Irvine. He's Mr. Long Beach Letter 2016 and has been profiled by numerous editorials, including the New York Times. He found and owns Getting Wolfie LLC, which provides education related to diversity and empowerment. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Ali Mushtaq. Hello and welcome to another episode of Sexology Podcast. I am so excited to have Dr. Ali Mushtaq on our show. Ali, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much for having me.
I am so curious to learn about you and all the wonderful thing that you're doing. I was just sharing with you before I started the recording that I read some of the articles that you were kind of featured on in LA Times and all of different media. And what a fascinating background that you have. And I'm very excited to hear about how you arrived to this place. So tell me, how did you get interested and how did you get introduced to the world of BDSM?
Oh, okay. So basically, I grew up in a very conservative area. It's in Orange County. I don't know if you've heard of it. But basically, I always knew that I was different. And so, I grew up in a very conservative area where, I came out at 15, and I remember people, ridiculing me and making me feel bad because I happened to be a sexual minority. But also what happened was I also got involved in things like trying to make the world better. So I tried to start a GSA, Gay Straight Alliance, at my high school, only to be met with resistance. So it was unfortunate that in the early beginnings of my teenage years where this sort of occurred, it was sort of like I was trying to feel who I was, and I always knew I was different, but I didn't know how to really exist with people who didn't understand that. So I thought the best way to do it is to change the world I lived in so I could be more comfortable. And so what happened was I ended up going to college, and I ended up realizing that, I'm around people that are able to sort of accept the fact that I'm gay, but at the same time, I noticed that there wasn't any place for me to really explore who I was as a sexual being. So what happened was I ended up going to graduate school for my PhD in UCSF, and so I moved from Orange County to San Francisco, and I ended up going to Folsom Street Fair literally the first week into my move of my PhD. So what happened was I got exposed to the world of leather and BDSM, and so I was exploring, and I ended up realizing this is something that I was into. But what ended up happening was I started to see there were a lot of things that also also needed to be done. So like, again, I grew up in a post 9/11 era. People were very Islamophobic. And so I was seeing bits and pieces of this sort of racism and other forms of isms that were happening around me, even in the leather world. So for me, like, I wanted to find a way to sort of address the fact that I am somebody who's into BDSM and leather, because I realized I liked it, but then also to coexist with my peers. So again, there were different mechanisms through which that happened. So for example, there's something called the title system, where people ended up becoming like the Miss Americas of the leather community. And so I ran for a couple contests, didn't work, but then I ended up winning Mr. Long Beach Leather. And since then, the rest has been history, where, for example, I've been able to use the profile and platform I've developed to sort of bring attention to questions about diversity, not only in terms of questions about race, but also being able to empower others, especially with other minorities, in terms of being able to actually get them to sort of explore who they are. And so now what I do is I sort of help people explore who they are, and I give them a framework and the tools they need to sort of address this.
Fascinating. It's wonderful that you came out when you were 15. My listeners, that they know that I grew up in Iran. I moved here when I was 17. And I feel like it's my experience that some Middle Eastern families, they're not necessarily open about sexual minorities. What was your experience of coming out like?
Yeah, so in general, like, my family's been relatively supportive compared to a lot of families. And you're right, absolutely right. Like, there is a lot of conservatism. Like, so for example, I grew up Muslim, and, you know, in Islam, it's sort of seen as like this religion that's super strict, and it's super like really, really like, it's a basically, I like to think about it as like a different version of being Catholic. And so basically, you know, there was some tension, I remember early on in my family, where there were certain issues, but then like it was interesting because, like, you know, they come from like the old world, right? They come from this place where like they don't have much education around gender and sexuality. So they think immediately, oh, well, maybe he wants to become a woman if he identifies as gay, you know, that kind of idea. And it's like, no, grandma, no, grandpa, that's not what happened. And so I ended up having to then help facilitate those conversations. And then essentially, like, you know, as time went on, my family became very accepting for the most part. That's
wonderful that after having some information about this kind of like differences and about what one's sexual orientation is, it seems like your family were welcoming. It's unfortunate that many families are not able to adjust, and that can create the rupture in family system. But it's beautiful that your family were kind of welcoming and supportive of you throughout this journey. It's interesting that I think it's one thing kind of coming out as someone who's gay, and I think that's another thing publicly being kind of expressing that this is something you're interested in the kind of leather community and BDSM. How was their kind of community's reaction to that? Was it similar, different? Tell us more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So what happened was, I mean, I think at least with my family, like, they were at first, well, because they're just like, okay, well, he's gay, so it's like we can't just ask him to constantly get married to a woman.
That wasn't really fair.
So I think at that point they just kind of had like an all bets are off approach, where it's like, all right, well, I mean, if he's already gay, so it's like, what can we do?
So they were kind of relatively okay. Did they know about BDSM community?
They knew about it, and they were just like, oh, I can't, he's doing that now. So it's like, okay, so I mean, that's just who he is. And, you know, they've then eventually were like, well, I mean, this is like what he's doing. He's not hurting anybody unconsensually. So we then will just sort of accept it.
Mm-hmm. Fabulous. It seems like they sound 100 times more open-minded than many of the families that I work with in my practice, and I think that's definitely a wonderful thing.
Yeah, indeed. And like, you know, in terms of like what I do, like, you know, I'm very aware that there are people that are dealing with a lot of internalized homophobia, and they feel like they are turned away by their families. And so what I've done is I've sort of thought about the ways in which basically society sort of where there affects the way they think about these issues. So I basically help people through my program to deal with it and to identify it and then deal with it as they're sort of able to. So.
And I think that's very important, seeing someone that's highly educated like you, but they're also open about their sexuality and who they are, and they're comfortable and confident about it. That can help many people to find guidance and also courage to kind of follow that path. I know that you were talking about the kind of like the misunderstanding that people have. And I'm kind of curious, what are some of the misconceptions that people have when it comes to BDSM world?
Oh, yeah, you're absolutely right. So, I mean, people think they sort of have one or two ideas. So on one end, like there's this sort of elusive, like, oh, it's like 50 Shades of BDSM where people are just taking like floggers and whips and like beating each other senseless and like in these sort of unconsensual ways. And they're like, oh, I don't like that. And then on the other hand, they also think where, you know, it's this idea of pathology where it's like, wow, like, you know, like, oh my God, like everybody's doing this and it just means you're dirty, you're depraved, you're perverted, and all these sort of medicalized ideas of pathology that are sort of associated with these alternative sexualities that aren't based on vanilla practices. So yeah, I mean, on one hand is the exotic and the other hand is the pathology.
And I think it's interesting that, you know, you use it as a vehicle and tool for empowerment and kind of like creating kind of it's an element of social justice for you. Tell us, how do you bridge that?
So a lot of my research and my background, so my research actually, like I have several peer-reviewed manuscripts that focus on things like race and equality, sexuality and equality and all these kinds of things. But then also like in my there's parts of my scholarly background, I've taught multiple courses that look at diversity and inclusion, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought, well, why not integrate that with my public platform, which is all about inclusivity in BDSM? So essentially, like the way I deal with questions about empowerment in BDSM is I sort of take a sort of intersectional approach to teaching people about BDSM. So specifically, like, you know, what are some of the factors that might sort of not only draw one into BDSM, but some of the factors that they might have problems working through. So for example, there's something in BDSM called race play, where some people exoticize the idea of basically like that relationship between a master and a slave from like the 1800s. So, and again, like even though in society we've moved on from that, there's a lot of people that tend to reproduce that in the bedroom. So basically for me, like I actually have a unique aspect in terms of what I do in my programs, where we sort of, I teach people that like, yeah, like, you know, that's sort of couched in this position of a historical framing of racism. But then like, here are some ways to move on using communication strategies. Because again, like if you were to in the bedroom say something that might be off color or something in the bedroom to somebody of color, that might ruin everybody's time, you know, essentially. So the idea behind that is, you know, I stress communication, and even like, you know, for those who want to experiment with things like paddling or spanking or something, you know, there's certain assumptions that they're making with their partner, and especially because of all these other aspects of how we actually have a sexual moment. So again, like I teach the communication skills to help them mitigate those issues.
Well, for our listeners that they might not familiar with race play, I know everything can be very different, almost as the story that you create, but what would be a kind of a common theme on those scenes might be like? What would that entail in a race?
Oh, I see. So basically, well, as I mentioned, like they sort of reproduce this sort of master-slave dynamic from slavery. So what they might do is they might basically use certain off-color language to basically dehumanize the person of color simply because that's what they used during slavery. They might actually maybe try to recreate it somehow by using like a flogger or a whip. And again, like just because you're using a flogger or a whip doesn't automatically mean you're doing race play, but just the idea that like you're using that language and you're sort of setting up that situation to make it like a master-slave relationship from slavery. Mm-hmm. And so and especially like a lot of folks with communities of color, they also notice that like they deal with situations where when they have a sexual partner, they're actually getting like, you know, like they're actually using this language with them in the bedroom. And so when they do that, I mean, again, it's on a basis of like their identities sort of being infringed on. And so that creates a dissonance for their identities. Yeah.
That's fascinating. And I think bringing awareness to that, it is a challenging task, because you're right that there are certain terms that trigger some of the transgenerational trauma and all of the trauma that one can experience. But still, you want to create that kind of like power play. So it's tricky to what to use, or how to bring it on. Do you teach them about the history? How do you inform people?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So what I do is in my section, in addition to introducing the fundamentals of BDSM, I talk about like consent being part of this. And so, of course, like that's sort of the basics of any like sexual interaction. And so basically I talk about like, okay, so not only am I teaching them consent, but I'm also bringing it up to the cultural level where it's like, well, okay, if somebody's not consenting to this, then therefore you're infringing on their identities. At that point, you're infringing on their personhood. So basically the way to mitigate that is to understand like, okay, so these are the stereotypes I might have. This is a historical perspective. And this is sort of where this is how you mitigate it. So for example, like being like, okay, so, I mean, if this happens in the bedroom, this is what, this is ahead of time in the negotiation. If this happens, how do we respond to it? Is this okay that this is happening? To what extent, because at what point do you say no? And not only that, but also empowering the other person to say no, because again, we know of many situations where people still like go on with the situation if they just don't feel comfortable leaving for whatever reason, because they feel like they're less of a person, or they want to make the other person happy, et cetera, et cetera. So basically I teach them to say no, or to say, or like how to bring these up in a way where it's equal to them, but also being able to like communicate.
I love that. And I agree that the key term is communication, because I know sometimes things that people play in the bedroom, some of the excitement of it is like some of the stuff are politically incorrect. And it's your bedroom, you can use whatever language you want, but it's important to make sure that both parties are consenting to this language and if they're enthusiastic and excited about this play. And I think like putting it in the context of history also can help people to have more awareness about, okay, where is this coming from? And also empowering people that if this is something that it's not okay for you, it doesn't feel comfortable, it doesn't mean that like you have to go along with it if you want to be part of this scene. So I think these are fascinating and important things to discuss.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, as you probably also are aware that gender is a huge part of this too. I mean, like even with the role play, I mean, I talk about even clarifying pronoun usage, because I give the example of like a cis man, right? And it's like, well, if you call him a woman as a submissive, that's probably going to turn him on. But if you say that to a trans woman, that's not going to that's her identity. Right. So at that point, it's like, not only are we doing this to be, respectful, but we're also doing this to make sure that the other person actually is getting turned on by the entire situation. So I feel like the more respectful you are, the better the play will be. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of the approach I take in my workshops.
That makes sense. So you can escalate things can get exciting if you are mindful of how to navigate these things. And it seems like you help them to repair any rupture that creates during the scene, and how can we go about that. And in the website, as I was reviewing your website, you mentioned that about the spirituality piece. Mm-hmm. And I know that I share with you, I'm coming from this similar background with kind of grew up in a Muslim community. And it's hard so I'm not practicing, my listeners, I know that, but I think it's hard to navigate spirituality when you're leaning into your sexuality. So how do you incorporate that?
That's a very good question. And I think that, the way I do it is I sort of take it back to our roots. So as you know, like there's some aspects of Islam, like for example, that practice self-flagellation, right? Like during Muharram, So basically
that is interesting too. Yeah. I haven't thought about it in the context of,
Yeah. So basically what I did was, I talk about the parallels between what they do in Muharram and the idea that they're engaging in self-flagellation because they're trying to establish that connection to a God or a higher power. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, I take a non-denominational approach. So it doesn't matter what your religious background is, if you have any, but the idea behind it is that you're able to connect with something other than yourself, or like other people on a level where it really focuses on the ability to connect. Because I know that especially now during coronavirus, we're in a situation where everybody feels isolated, they feel lonely. And so I sort of offer them a tool to sort of establish like, hey, like, my goal is to connect, or my intention is to connect, or to really sort of undo some of the traumas or the bad thing that's happened to me. And so I give them a way to sort of work through that. And so it's almost like I'm trying to sort of hit home the message, I guess, throughout the entire thing is that, we really are just one person regardless of our differences. Mm-hmm. And to really honor the human being regardless of our race, our gender, our sexuality, and to really just focus on the idea that we are able to connect to each other. And by undoing all of the emotional blocks within ourselves, we're able to better connect and we'll be better people. And incidentally, do that through BDSM, that's the way to do it.
That's fascinating. And I haven't thought about it from that angle, but what you brought up, that completely makes sense. And what's interesting is when I have colleagues, I have clients that they are part of the BDSM community. And what I never seen some person of color in a sense that coming from a Middle Eastern background within that community. Is there a big representation of people from kind of Middle Eastern background in that community, or I'm kind of curious about the diversity, and I know it's very different. So I bet it's different in Germany than in the United States. But what do you see perhaps in the US or in California? It seems like you're practicing in California.
Yeah, so that's actually an interesting question, because you're right. Like, I think, when I talk about my presentations, when I do like BDSM and race talks and stuff like that, I do notice that there are even BDSM cultures because of the different demographics. So in the United States, there's an emphasis on diversity, for example, where people are slowly being inclusive of people who are not necessarily white, not necessarily heterosexual, not necessarily cisgendered men. So there's a lot of diversity here. But in terms of South Asians, there's several of us that are in the community. But again, like we're sort of a dime a dozen. Like I know like the one person from Seattle versus the one person from like Washington. but then I hear other stories. Like for example, like there's some folks from Pakistan and other countries that want to get into it from England, but they're not necessarily given footing because the race and culture works very different there. And not only that, but even like the types of things that are fetishized or things that can be fetishized vary from the US versus places like in England and Germany. So for example, being conscious about race play that is an issue, and that's something that that can sometimes dehumanize rather than empower. That we're very cognizant about that, at least marginally in the United States, versus you wouldn't necessarily see that happen in places like Europe. But then actually, interestingly, if you look at BDSM in different countries though, so like for example, people like in India, for example, they're very curious about all of this. And so for them, they're sort of still in the position of learning things like consent and affirmative consent and being able to sort of say like, hey, like, yes means yes kind of thing. So everybody's sort of in different places with their play, but that's just sort of what I've noticed in terms of my experiences with these communities.
How can a community be more inclusive with people of color? Is it like including them in the plays, or because I would imagine like you are into what you're into, similar to kind of our erotic template. So what are some of the efforts to make things more inclusive?
Yeah, so basically, I think there are multiple levels when you talk about BDSM, because I mean, people, as you might be familiar with, that people engage in BDSM without even knowing it. Right. So, I mean, there are different levels. I mean, so for example, there's representation on the institutional level where you're including people of color on like, flyers for events and stuff like that to really say like, hey, we're inclusive here. But then there's also the question of being inclusive on the play level where people are being educated to realize, like, for example, if you play with a non-white partner and you're like flogging them on their back, like, you might not necessarily see red, so just that, even that awareness that like, like you might not even see like the color come out. So then like it is, and then when you're flogging them, it's like, well, what is the limit to like not do this, or what is the limit to like gauge to like slow down or something like that. So I mean, that's really important. And then again, that goes back to the cultural stereotypes and the history, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that like, there's that level as well, but also just again using simple communication techniques to sort of address this. It's like, okay, so like not only are you looking at a visual cue, but then you're also looking at things like body language, like if they're like tensing up and stuff like that, and they're continuing to do so. But then also things like, are you able to talk about it? Are you able to talk through like, hey, like, is this too intense for you? Or are you, that kind of thing. And I know, and it kind of breaks the mood a little bit. So then again, it's up to you to kind of like, work it in. But at the same time, it's like, there is multiple ways that we can integrate diversity into even our practices. So even going back to the folks that are not even interested in BDSM, it's the question of like being able to communicate and being able to be like, even though I might not visually see certain things that I'm used to, what are some of the ways in which we can communicate, and again, through verbal communication, through specific communication, ways in which we can actually get that diversity and inclusivity. Because I think when we're talking about diversity, we're talking about the ability to affirm somebody who's different than us.
Right.
To affirm that, not only are you a person, but that your sex life matters, and that your sexual pleasure matters. And I know that like if you look at even like the history of like the women's orgasms in this country, right? The question of like how doctors didn't even know and psychologists didn't even know where like clitoral orgasms were a thing, right?
Right.
And so it's a similar process where it's like we're learning to now sort of being inclusive, not just of gender differences, but also things like racial differences, et cetera, when we are engaging in sexual pleasure.
I think those are very valid and important topics you brought up. And I love that. I'm always passionate about kind of understanding how race plays into all of these plays. And I love the different elements that you talked about, different parts that you talked about that one can include to make sure people of all sorts with all sorts of diversity might be kind of get included in the community. So I'm kind of curious to hear that, like, if there's a person of color listening to this podcast, they're curious about power exchange, where can they explore it more? Because I love that you said like many people already doing elements of this in their sexual life, that they don't know it is part of this power exchange. But what are some of the things people can do if they're specifically interested in exploring this?
Well, there's a lot of resources out there. I mean, depending on where you live, there are certain nonprofits that focus on learning BDSM. There are also places like dungeons and play spaces. There are places that sell erotic wear. There are places, there are multiple places. There's also like websites and stuff. But specifically, there's the one I'm developing that focuses on this idea of how is it that you can play, but also do so inclusively. And so in general, that's sort of where I'm providing a lot of my tools to folks. So then that way they can improve their sex life regardless of whoever they are. And so again, the way I think about it is the more you are inclusive, the better your play will be, regardless of, how is it that, regardless of whether you're a racial minority or not. So then that way it's like, the more inclusive you are, the less mistakes you'll make, quote unquote. And then, everybody will be, happy. And so happy people equals, less angry people.
Well, that makes sense. And Ali, I love that you talked about your website and your resources, because I feel like any realm of sex and sexuality and sexual play, things can go very wrong. Like people can see things in porn, and my listeners know there's nothing wrong with porn, but it's not sex ed. So if you're seeing a scene in the porn and perhaps you might need more education on what to do to implement it in your bedroom. So I love that you are developing these programs and resources. So tell us more about your programs. What would they entail?
So basically, my program is essentially the standard BDSM education, which is essentially things like consent and negotiation. But I take it a step further because in general, I don't believe in telling people okay, so to engage in BDSM, you always have to spank somebody or something. I believe that everybody should be empowered to make their own decisions and to use their creativity to build, their own BDSM interactions. So what I did is I developed a program that allows people to build their sexual experiences however they want. But then what I do is I then sort of take that level a step further, and then I say okay, so based on how you're doing what you want, now let's do some inside work and understand why you're into certain sexual things. And then through that, what I do is I sort of point out sort of the cultural historical things that might affect their negotiation or their interpretation of sexuality, and then I have them work through in order to actually become more sexually empowered. So not only are you getting the BDSM for BDSM's sake, but then you're also doing the inside work that can hopefully get them to become happier, essentially, and to experience sexuality more freely. And by being able to sort of identify those factors, what I do is then I take it to the next level where we talk about the spiritual aspect of BDSM. So it's like, now that we're working on ourselves as individuals, now let's see how we can bridge it onto a more collective sphere. So it's almost like you're not only learning the tools of BDSM, and of course I talk about flogging, spanking, et cetera, but just being able to not only do the inside work that's required to explore these things in a non-triggering kind of way. And if you have triggers, like, what are some of the ways we can work through them? But then also talking about ways in which we're able to then connect after we're sort of done with that work. So it's like, now that we've sort of talked about this, now that we brought these out to the forefront, I then sort of talk about it from the perspective of spirituality and then being able to connect. So not only are you able to play in an erotic level, but then you're also able to play on the spiritual level as well. And then that way, it's like there's this sort of dialectic of being able to kind of say, yeah, like I'm into sexuality, I'm into BDSM, but it's not just because I'm turned on by it, but it's also because I'm able to now connect with other people. And so, because again, like we all feel lonely and we all feel like, I don't know about others, but I've been sort of locked out in my house for the last 8 months. So basically, I even provide individual modes of BDSM play and being able to sort of get people to understand, like, okay, so you can actually work through these issues, because, I know that a lot of therapy and psychology focuses on the individual, but it's also the question of the cultural background. And it's like really being able to understand, like, why do I find X people attractive? And it's kind of like, I give this example of coronavirus porn, where, like, for example, like, I remember since the pandemic, like, people like suddenly started making coronavirus porn. It's like, well, those historical circumstances affect what their sexual desires were. And so incidentally, coronavirus porn was born. And so with that example, that's sort of how I sort of approach empowerment and being like, well, yeah, like, because we have these certain historical modes of, relating to one another, like things like, misogyny, sexism, as well as racism, et cetera, how can we then work inward? And then how can we even undo those things? So not only are we dealing with a sort of undoing of sexual trauma, but we're also doing a sort of reprogramming of cultural acceptance and cultural connectedness. And I even make clear, like, I'm not a licensed psychologist, I'm a sociologist. So a lot of my expertise is in culture and society. And so I refer to folks to therapists when appropriate. But at the same time, it's like I just have something to offer in the sense of, well, this is my background in this society. Let me use it to say, if you can use it as a tool to help you, if this is something that you are interested in.
Well, Ali, I think that's fabulous that you provide that, because I think our sexuality can open the door to our understanding of ourselves and our psyche. I part of my practice working with sex therapy clients, but even with all of my clients, we talk about sex and sexuality, because it can give us lots of good information about who we are, what are we drawn to, our desire. So I think it's wonderful that you created this program, that you teach people the tools and strategies and skills they need, but also you added this other component of let's kind of take a look at what can we do to help you to use this as a way to understand yourself better and connect with yourself and previous generations.
Thank you. Yeah. And, as a therapist and counselor, you've also seen probably even when sexuality goes wrong. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of folks' concern is when they're like, oh, well, like, what if I get into a situation where, like, I'm constantly being, like, beat over unconsensually, right? So I even address those dynamics as well. So, like, when I teach, I've done workshops for LMFT students. Mm-hmm. And what happened was the common question I get is like, well, how do you know when it becomes abuse? Mm-hmm. I get this every class I'm teaching when it's related to this. And it's interesting because it's like, well, when you even teach about domestic violence in psychology courses, it's like, well, like, what is that line? Like, so you're even like having to like gauge that too. And I know as a professional, it can be very difficult. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's like, again, I even mentioned like that if you have a certain situation, you need to get it checked out by an actual professional. So just so you know, but at the same time, based on my experiences, I have known of situations that have gone wrong. So this is, and I hear the tools for you to realize like, okay, so like, what are the sort of checklists that you can kind of go through for at least, you have some kind of gauge or some kind of mirror for you to be like, yeah, maybe this might be not something that's for me, or that this dynamic might not be okay. So basically what I do is I get them to a stage where they're able to go to somebody like you in terms of your expertise to be like, yeah, like this might be happening. Please evaluate it. But yeah, I mean, I think that more situations, because I mean, I've seen it happen countless times where, somebody has, done these things and they have gone awry. Mm-hmm. And so for me, like, I want to be able to make sure that people don't have to endure these situations and to mitigate them as much as possible. So basically, my goal is to just make sure people are happy and they're empowered, and they're also doing this idea of empowerment through this idea that they are willing to consensually express who they are. Mm-hmm. And so again, like there's a gender dynamic as well, but I mean, I've seen countless examples even in queer and gay communities where this has happened. Mm-hmm. So I mean, and then it's like, then how is it that we're able to not only explore our sexuality, but again, consent becomes part of that freedom, right? Where you're able to then withdraw that consent. And again, this is not only on the dynamic level where, we understand that certain norms can be naturalized, but again, like, where do those norms come from? What is the context around those norms, and like, what are some of the ways in which we can counter them through actual practices?
Well, I think you brought up such a wonderful, important point, and I appreciate that you have that kind of view of that, like any kind of sexual act, not necessarily only with BDSM, that things can go extreme in a wrong way, become abusive. I've seen it in monogamous couples that are quote unquote vanilla. I've seen it in all sorts of relationships. But specifically when you talk about consent, I think actually the BDSM community, they're doing a fabulous job with communication most of the time, and negotiation and aftercare. So I think like they are doing a better job than the rest of us. But I feel like I've seen situations that people are on a 24/7 kind of a power exchange situation. And then how would that be as far as consent? What is it? Do you teach people how frequently people need to check in about consent?
So for me, like I adopt in our program, we adopt the affirmative consent action, where basically consent can be withdrawn at any time. Mm-hmm. So it's essentially like the idea that consent's ongoing. There's other dimensions to that as we talk about, but we have actual safeguards within the play itself to actually say like, hey, like if I don't like this, we need to stop somehow. Mm-hmm. So I actually provide different scenarios where, like, for example, I talk about like how during a scene, like, you can either use safe words or you can use the red, yellow, green system. But we also talk about like how even though when you're in the BDSM world, like, it's about being aware that there are risks. So, and it's this idea that like, things that you might be doing might have all these risks, not only physical, but also emotional and psychological as well. So again, and it's true with any sexual activity, but just the idea that we're making that explicit for people so they at least understand, like, yeah, I mean, if you're going to go out and suspend yourself, like, you're going to, like, there's a risk involved. So, I mean, in that way, it's like, it sort of gives them the agency to make their own decisions. But I think for a lot of folks, like, they feel like, they've either had their trust or consent infringed upon in some way because they didn't say anything, or in another experience is they've basically been in a situation where it was never given at all. Mm-hmm. So again, like, what I do is I sort of give them the communication tools to sort of stress that, like, yeah, you are an agent in this situation where you can make those decisions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's fabulous. So I bet many of our listeners are curious about where they can find your program, your courses. So tell us more about how can they reach you.
Sure. Thank you so much. So basically, my email is ollie@gettingwolfie, WOLFIE.com. You can find me at gettingwolfie.com, GETTINGWOLFIE.com. There's also my Instagram and Twitter, Getting Wolfie. And then I have a Facebook page. So, I'm definitely looking forward to meeting some of your listeners.
Wonderful. And the information will be in the show notes if people want to check those out. Ali, thank you so much for coming on this show. This was very informative for me, and I bet many of our listeners learned a lot from our conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moali. I appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation useful. I loved Ali's approach when it comes to teaching about BDSM. When I hear about BDSM, when I think about BDSM, I always think about this Caucasian, maybe European, German man doing this power exchange. And I love that he was focusing on inclusivity, which was very important. And since I met Ali, I've been obsessed with his Instagram account. It's so engaging and educational. A few days ago, he had his grandmother and he was teaching her about flocking, which was fascinating. I highly encourage you to check it out. As always, if you like this show, remember to leave us a rating or review wherever you listen to this podcast. Your reviews really matters. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll talk next week. Thanks for listening to the Sexology Podcast. For more great content, visit www.sexologypodcast.com. Please be advised that information presented on this podcast is not a substitute for seeking help from a licensed mental health provider.